4 years after the Titanic sank, I stepped aboard her sister. She was bigger, she was safer, she carried enough lifeboats. Her watertight protection had been improved, and the men who built her had been given something Titanic's builders never had. A warning. They knew what could happen now. They had seen 1,500 people disappear into the North Atlantic. They had seen lifeboats leave half empty while other people remained trapped aboard. They had seen steel, money, engineering, and confidence vanish beneath black water. So when Titanic's younger sister was completed, she carried the lessons of the dead inside her. That should have made me feel better. It did, for a while, because here is the part most people do not know. Titanic's sister sank too. She reached the bottom faster than Titanic did. And somehow, almost everyone aboard survived. My name is Eleanor Calloway. I was 26 years old when I first saw His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic. And even now, after everything that happened, I still remember my first thought. Not beautiful, not magnificent, not safe. Large, she was impossibly large. You have to understand what that meant to someone like me. I had grown up in Kent, in a town where the church tower was the tallest thing for miles. Our houses were small. Our roads were narrow. Our lives were supposed to be smaller still. A woman might marry, keep a house, raise children, visit her mother on Sunday, know which neighbor had borrowed the flour and which neighbor had forgotten to return it. There was comfort in the smallness. Then Europe went to war, and suddenly nothing was small anymore. Armies moved by the hundreds of thousands. Trains carried men toward places their mothers had never heard of. Hospitals expanded into schools, country houses, and public buildings. Letters arrived by the sack. Casualty lists filled newspaper columns. The world had become enormous. Britannic looked as though someone had built that enormous world into a ship. I stood at the bottom of the gangway with my bag in my hand and stared upward. White hull, green stripe, huge red crosses, funnels rising above me, deck after deck after deck. She had been designed for another life. That was obvious. Britannic had not originally been meant to carry bandages. She had been meant to carry wealthy passengers across the Atlantic, people with trunks. People with servants, people who complained about dinner, people who changed clothes before dinner, people who had opinions about curtains, but the war arrived before Britannic could become that ship. Luxury became useless. What Britain needed was space. Beds, operating rooms, medical stores, a vessel large enough to cross the Mediterranean and bring wounded men home. So the ocean liner became a hospital. Britannic had already served as a hospital ship before this voyage, carrying sick and wounded men through the Mediterranean. I was a VAD, Voluntary Aid Detachment. The initials sounded more official than I felt. I was not one of the fully trained professional nurses who had spent years learning their work. They knew things I did not. They had authority I did not. I respected them for it. A VAD learned first aid, home nursing, hygiene, ward work, how to follow instructions. How to work until her feet hurt and then continue working because feet were not considered a medical emergency. We were useful. That was the word I preferred. Useful. I joined because Edward went to France. That was not the reason I gave my mother. The reason I gave my mother was duty. Duty was easier for mothers. Duty sounded controlled. Duty sounded patriotic. Duty sounded like something printed on a recruiting poster. The truth was simpler. The man I intended to marry had gone somewhere dangerous. I could not follow him, so I went somewhere useful. Edward had left for France in 1914. His letters came when the army allowed them to come. Sometimes 2 arrived in 1 week. Sometimes nothing came for 12 days. The absence of a letter could turn an ordinary breakfast into torture. Then one would arrive, "Dear Eleanor, I am well. Please tell your mother I still remember her apple tart. Weather terrible, food worse. Do not worry. Love, Edward, do not worry." Soldiers wrote that often. I came to understand that do not worry meant exactly the opposite. It meant there was something worth worrying about that the writer had decided not to describe. Working around wounded men taught me the same lesson. What people do not say is often the most important part, so I learned to listen to silence. That skill would become useful aboard Britannic, because ships have silences too. The first day aboard, there was almost too much to absorb. Passageways, stairs, doors, deck letters, instructions, boat stations, ward assignments, emergency routes. I was assigned below. The hospital spaces had rows of beds prepared for men who were not aboard yet. We were sailing toward the eastern Mediterranean to collect patients. That meant the wards had a strange quality. Everything was ready, nobody needed it. Beds made, blankets folded, dressings stacked, basins cleaned. Instruments waiting. An empty hospital is not peaceful, it is expectant. Every empty bed says the same thing. Someone will need me soon. I remember running my hand across one of the sheets. White, tight, clean. I wondered who would lie there. A man from a fever case? A soldier with a shattered leg? Someone younger than me? Most likely. War was very good at making younger men look old. I had seen boys arrive in hospitals with 18-year-old faces and 40-year-old eyes. Britannic was going to bring some of them home. That was what mattered. Not her size, not her history, not her famous family, but it was impossible to forget the family completely. Everyone knew Titanic. You did not need to be interested in ships. Titanic had become something larger than a ship. How could a ship so modern lose so many people? How could there not be enough boats? How could confidence become catastrophe so quickly? Britannic existed in the shadow of those questions. And that shadow had changed her. After Titanic, Britannic had been altered in important ways, stronger watertight protection and far greater provision for getting people into lifeboats. You could see the lessons above deck, lifeboats, more provision for getting people off the ship. You could see lessons in the structure too, though I did not understand the engineering then. Bulkheads, subdivision, additional protection. Words sailors and engineers understood better than I did. To me, the meaning was simpler. Titanic had died. Britannic had been changed because of it. That fascinated me. A ship remembering another ship. Then they put that memory into steel, into regulations, into lifeboats, into doors, into procedures. That is one of the few useful things human beings can do with disaster. We cannot reverse it. We cannot bargain with the dead. We cannot give Titanic another night. But we can force the next ship to carry the knowledge. Britannic carried it everywhere. And still, there were moments when I looked at her and felt something I could not explain. Not fear, not exactly, perhaps suspicion. Because safety is a strange thing. The more people tell you something is safe, the more you begin to wonder why they need to keep saying it. One afternoon, I was on deck with another VAD named Ruth Mercer. Ruth was from Birmingham. She had the ability to complain about almost anything while sounding cheerful about it. The tea, her shoes, the wind. The mattresses, the Navy, the weather, she could turn discomfort into conversation. We were watching crewmen work near one of the boat stations. Ruth nodded toward the equipment. Enough for everybody, so they say. That is comforting. Yes, she looked at me. You do not sound comforted. I am. You sound exactly like a woman who is not. I smiled. What would you like me to say? That this ship is perfectly safe. I looked toward the boats, then toward the sea. I don't think ships are perfectly anything. Ruth laughed. That is a terrible slogan. It would be honest. White Star will never hire you. I think the Red Cross has already made that problem unnecessary. She laughed again, then she became quiet. Did you know anyone on Titanic? No, neither did I. She rested her arms against the rail. My father read every newspaper story. So did mine. He said no ship should ever be called unsinkable. I looked at her. Was Titanic actually called that? Oh, Eleanor, don't ruin the story with details. That stayed with me. Don't ruin the story with details. People love stories that fit easily inside one sentence. Titanic was unsinkable. Titanic hit an iceberg. Titanic sank. Britannic was safer. Britannic learned the lesson. Those sentences feel complete. History rarely is. Britannic was safer in important ways. That did not make the sea harmless. And by 1916, the sea contained something Titanic had not needed to fear. War. We entered the Mediterranean. I had expected danger to look dangerous. Perhaps everyone does. Storm clouds, high waves, enemy ships on the horizon, something visible, something you could point toward and say, there. That is the thing that can kill us. But the most dangerous things in those waters were invisible. Submarines and mines, especially mines. A mine is patient in a way a gun cannot be. A gun requires someone to aim it. A shell must be fired. A torpedo must be launched. But a mine can wait. Nobody has to hate you in the moment it kills you. The person who placed it may be miles away, days away, weeks away. The mine waits in the water. A ship approaches. Metal meets mechanism. Then the war happens all at once. I thought about mines more than I admitted. Everyone did. Nobody needed to discuss them. Britannic wore enormous red crosses on her sides. She was a hospital ship. The markings announced her purpose. This vessel carries medical personnel. This vessel carries wounded men. This vessel is not here to fight. There were international rules surrounding hospital ships. Rules mattered. But by the 4th year of war, I had already learned something about rules. Rules are strongest when everyone who might break them decides not to. A rule cannot stop a mine from waiting in a channel. We continued east. On the evening before everything changed, I stood outside for perhaps 10 minutes. The air was mild. The ship cut through dark water. There were no city lights, no English coast, no familiar landmarks, only Britannic, the sea, and stars. I put both hands on the rail. Behind me, a door opened. Ruth came out. "You planning to sleep?" "Eventually." "Excellent, I wanted confirmation." She stood beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Funny, isn't it?" "What?" "All those empty beds." I knew what she meant. Tomorrow, we were moving closer to the places where men waited to be collected. The hospital ship had spent days preparing for suffering. The suffering was somewhere ahead. "I keep wondering who will get mine," Ruth said. "Your bed? The one in my ward. You say that as though you own it." "I made it twice today. I have established a relationship." I smiled. Then she asked, "Do you think we'll be busy?" "Yes." "How busy?" "I don't know." She nodded. Neither of us said the obvious thing. We were worried about the wounded. We were not worried about ourselves. That distinction seems foolish now, but it was genuine. Britannic felt like the safe part of the war. We were not in a trench. We were not crossing no man's land. We were not under artillery fire. We were not charging anyone. We were nurses aboard a hospital ship painted white beneath a clear sky. Danger belonged to the men we were going to collect, not to us. That is how disaster often enters a life, not through the door you are watching, through another one. Then morning came. November 21st, 1916. The sea near Kiev was calm. The sky was clear. Britannic continued through the Aegean on her way toward Mudras. More than 1,000 people were aboard, but the wards were not packed with wounded men. We were outbound to collect them. I ate breakfast. I complained that the tea was weak. Ruth told me that English women were legally required to complain about tea whenever abroad. I went below. The wards were quiet. Beds waiting. Sheets white. Bandages stacked. Everything ready for wounded men. I sat down with a roll of dressing material in my hands. There are moments in your life that become sacred only because of what happens immediately afterward. The last ordinary breakfast. The last ordinary conversation. The last time you close a door without knowing you will never open it again. The last moment when the floor beneath your feet is simply a floor. I did not know I was inside one of those moments. I was thinking about bandages, about Edward, about whether I had written my mother, about nothing important. Then Britannic moved beneath me, not forward, not the steady vibration of engines, something else. A violent movement traveled through the steel, up through the deck, into the bed frames, into the cabinets, into my shoes, into my bones. The entire ship seemed to take one enormous breath, and then the bandage fell from my hands. For 1 second, I watched it roll across the floor. That is the detail I remember, not the explosion, not screaming, not water. A bandage, white cloth rolling away from me across a white floor. It stopped beneath an empty bed. Then the ship moved again. This time I heard it. A deep metallic groan somewhere inside Britannic. Not loud in the way a cannon is loud, deeper than that. A sound transmitted through steel. The kind of sound you feel through your feet before your ears decide what they have heard. Something had happened below us, something large, something wrong. Ruth looked up from the cabinet across the ward. Neither of us spoke. The electric lights were still burning. The beds were still in rows. The glass bottles were still on their shelves. Everything looked almost exactly as it had 10 seconds earlier. Except the floor. The floor was no longer level, very slightly at first, enough that I wondered whether I was imagining it. Then one of the bottles began to slide, slowly, across the shelf. It touched another bottle, glass against glass, a tiny sound. I stared at it. Ruth stared at it. Then she said, "Eleanor." I know, she did not need to finish. The ship had taken a list. Then the alarm began. Everything changed. The sound filled the corridor outside. Doors opened. Feet moved. Voices called instructions. Training replaced thought. That is what training is for. Not to make you brave, not to remove fear. Training gives your body something to do while your mind is still trying to understand why the world has changed. "Boat station," someone shouted. Ruth was already moving. I bent to pick up the bandage. I still do not know why. The ship might have been sinking beneath me, and I stopped to retrieve a roll of cloth. Perhaps some part of me still believed the ward mattered. Perhaps putting the bandage back on the table meant the world could still be organized. I placed it beside the others. Then I followed Ruth. The corridor outside was filling with people. Nurses, orderlies, medical officers, crewmen moving in the opposite direction. Nobody was running wildly. Not yet. Britannic was too large for the danger to feel immediate. That was the deception. That thought lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then another tremor passed through the deck. A door slammed somewhere ahead. Someone shouted for a passageway to be cleared, and the angle beneath my feet increased. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough that walking toward the stairs felt different. Enough that everyone noticed. Enough that nobody needed to ask whether the ship was damaged. We climbed. From the lower decks toward daylight. The stairs were crowded, but there was order. Britannic was carrying medical staff and crew, people accustomed to instructions. We had drilled. We knew where we were supposed to go. That mattered. It mattered more than I understood at the time. Ruth stayed in front of me. At the next landing, she looked back. "You there?" "Yes." "Good." That was all. No speech about courage. No dramatic promise. Just confirmation. "You there?" "Yes." "Good." Sometimes survival is built from conversations that small. What I know is that Britannic had been struck on the starboard side near the bow. What I learned afterward is that the explosion opened the sea to the ship. The watertight doors were ordered shut. The protective systems began doing what they had been designed to do. This was the moment when the lessons of Titanic were supposed to matter. And some of them did. Britannic had been changed after her sister's loss. Her internal protection had been strengthened. Some bulkheads had been extended higher. Measures had been taken to make flooding less likely to overwhelm the ship in the same way. But safety systems do not exist alone. They exist inside circumstances. And on that morning, circumstances were conspiring against Britannic. Several factors would matter: the damage, the compartments, the ship's movement, and something far more ordinary: windows, portholes. That is one of the cruel things about disasters. They rarely depend on one magnificent failure. Often, enormous systems are defeated by small openings. Britannic was a hospital ship. Hospital wards needed air. The Mediterranean was mild. Some portholes had been opened for ventilation. That made sense when the sea was outside. It became something else when the ship began to list. As Britannic settled lower on her damaged side, openings that had been safely above the water moved closer to it. Then some of them reached it. The sea found them. Water does not care whether an opening was made for ventilation. It only knows that the opening is there. The watertight compartments could resist water moving through the ship. They could not prevent the sea from entering through openings above them once those openings were submerged. That distinction helped kill Britannic. I did not know any of that while climbing the stairs. All I knew was that the floor kept changing beneath me. We reached another deck. A crewman stood at the junction. "Up." "Keep moving," someone asked. "What happened?" "Mine, likely." The word traveled faster than the man who said it. Mine, there it was, the word we had avoided for days. It moved through the passageway. A mine. Did he say mine? Where? Are we sinking? Nobody answered the last question. We kept climbing. The ship was still moving. I could feel the engines. The deep vibration remained beneath my feet. At first, that reassured me. The engines are running, therefore the ship is alive. That was my reasoning, and it was wrong. A dying ship can still have working engines. A wounded animal can still run. Movement does not mean safety. Sometimes movement makes the wound worse. Captain Charles Bartlett faced a decision no captain wants. Britannic was badly damaged. Land was not impossibly far away. The island of Kea was close enough to be seen. If the ship could reach shallow water, perhaps she could be grounded. Beached. Saved from disappearing completely. A ship resting on the bottom near shore was better than a ship on the bottom of a deep channel. So Britannic continued moving. Toward land, toward Kea. The decision made sense. That is important. History becomes too easy if every bad outcome is turned into evidence that somebody was stupid. People inside disasters do not know the ending. They make decisions using what they know in that moment. Bartlett was trying to save his ship. He could see land. Britannic still had power. For a time, beaching her must have seemed possible. But forward movement forced more water against the damaged hull. And as the ship settled, the open portholes became increasingly dangerous. Britannic was not merely filling. She was helping the sea enter. We emerged onto an upper deck. Sunlight hit my face. That shocked me more than anything below. The morning was still beautiful. Blue sky, blue sea, Kia visible in the distance. No storm, no darkness, no great waves. There are disasters that at least have the courtesy to look like disasters. This one did not. Britannic looked magnificent. White hull, red crosses, morning sun, people moving toward lifeboat stations. And beneath all of it, the ship was dying. Ruth stood beside me. She was breathing hard. Still think ships aren't perfectly anything? I looked at her. I almost laughed. Almost. You remembered that? I remember useful things. That was not useful. It is now. The deck was crowded. Crewmen prepared boats. Orders moved from man to man. People tried to understand whether we were actually abandoning ship or merely preparing to. That uncertainty became its own problem. Britannic had lifeboats. That was one of the great differences between her and Titanic. Enough capacity, enough places, enough equipment. Titanic's passengers had faced a brutal arithmetic. More people than seats. Britannic did not begin with that problem. There was room, if the order came properly. If the boats were lowered properly, if the ship remained stable long enough, the system could work. But lifeboats are not magic. A lifeboat is safe only if you can get it safely away from the ship. And Britannic was still moving. I looked over the side. The water rushed along the hull. That frightened me, not because I understood the mechanics. I did not, but the speed was obvious. We were not sitting dead in the water. The ship was making way. A lifeboat lowered into that moving sea would not simply float beside us. It would enter currents created by the hull, by the motion, by the machinery, by the enormous turning screws at the stern. I had seen Britannic's propellers only in photographs. You do not think about a ship's propeller while standing on the deck. It belongs beneath you. Behind you, out of sight. An engine room thing, a mechanical fact, not part of ordinary passenger life. But Britannic's propellers were enormous. Bronze blades built to push a vessel of nearly 50,000 tons through the sea. They were designed to move water, huge quantities of it, continuously, efficiently, without emotion. If you were inside the ship, that power carried you. If you were in a small boat near the stern, that same power became something else. I did not understand that yet, but some of the crew did. Orders were shouted not to lower boats prematurely. Wait, remain at stations. Wait for instructions. That word again. Wait, then a new sound reached us. Not an explosion, not an alarm, a deep mechanical noise from behind. The engines, still working, the ship pressing forward. Kia looked close enough to encourage hope, far enough to kill it. I remember looking toward the island and thinking, if we can reach that, we are safe. I had no idea how much distance separated us. Distances on water lie. An island that looks close can remain far away for a very long time. Britannic's bow was settling. The list was worsening. The ship was no longer behaving like something that intended to remain afloat. More people understood now. You could see the realization move across faces. Not panic, recognition, this is serious. That is the moment fear changes. Before it, people ask questions. After it, they begin watching exits. A crewman passed us quickly. Stay clear, wait for the order. What's happening? Water forward. Can she stay up? He did not answer. He did not need to. Behind him, another team worked one of the giant davits. A lifeboat hung above the sea. People began moving toward it. Not all of them had been ordered to. That mattered. Confusion spreads differently from panic. Panic screams. Confusion imitates. One person climbs into a boat. Another thinks the order must have been given. Then another. Soon a boat is occupied because everyone assumes someone else knows more. I saw one being prepared below us. Then another. The ship was still moving. I watched the water streaming past. Ruth followed my eyes. Should they be doing that? I don't know. That answer frightened me. I had spent months learning what to do. Now the correct action depended on things far beyond nursing. Engines, currents, angles, orders, propellers. The lifeboat began descending. Slowly, people inside it gripped the sides. Another boat farther aft was already closer to the surface. Crewmen shouted. Somebody yelled to stop. Another voice yelled something I could not understand. The boats continued down. The first reached the water. For a moment, nothing happened. It floated, a normal lifeboat on a beautiful blue sea. People were safe. I remember thinking exactly that. They made it. Then the boat moved sideways, not toward the island, not away from Britannic, along the ship, toward the stern. A man inside began rowing desperately. Another shouted. The current took them faster. I stepped closer to the rail. Ruth grabbed my arm. Eleanor. The boat continued backward. Then I understood what lay behind it. The engines were still running, and somewhere beneath the water, Britannic's propellers were still turning. That is the sentence that stayed with me, not because I understood it immediately. I did not. From the boat deck, all I could see was a lifeboat moving backward along the white side of the ship. At first slowly, then faster. The men inside pulled at the oars. One blade entered the water badly and twisted from a man's hands. Someone stood. Someone shouted at him to sit down. The boat continued toward the stern, toward machinery we could not yet see. Ruth tightened her grip on my arm. Why are they going that way? I knew the answer now. The ship is pulling them. Another lifeboat had reached the water farther aft. That one began moving too, the same direction. The same terrible sideways drift. People on the boat deck started shouting. Stop the engines! Stop them! I do not know who shouted first. Perhaps a sailor, perhaps an officer. Perhaps everybody understood at the same moment. But understanding was not the same as stopping thousands of tons of machinery. Britannic was enormous. Her engines were far below us. Orders had to travel. Machinery had to respond. Momentum had to disappear. And until that happened, the sea around the stern belonged to the propellers. The first lifeboat was close enough now that I could see faces. That is something I wish I could forget. Distance protects you from detail. A crowd is easier to remember than a person. A boat is easier to remember than faces, but I saw faces. A woman looking over her shoulder, a man pulling an oar, someone standing near the bow, another person waving both arms toward the ship. They knew. They could hear the shouting above them. They could see where the current was taking them. They understood exactly what waited behind them, and they could not row away from it. There is a kind of terror that comes from not knowing what is happening. This was the opposite. They knew, we knew, everyone knew. The boat disappeared behind part of the hull from where I stood. For perhaps 2 seconds, I could no longer see it. Then came the sound, wood breaking, not one crack. Many, a rapid sequence. Sharp, violent, then screaming. The entire boat deck seemed to stop breathing. I did too. I had heard men scream in hospitals. Pain has many voices. A burn sounds different from a broken bone. A man waking from surgery sounds different from a man who knows surgery cannot save him. I thought I understood screaming. I did not understand that sound, because it came together with machinery. Human voices inside the noise of turning metal. Then pieces of the lifeboat appeared behind the ship. Wood, an oar, something white, people in the water. I turned away. Ruth did not. Her hand disappeared from my arm. I looked at her. She stood completely still. Her mouth was open. No sound came out. Ruth, nothing. Ruth, she looked at me. That was a lifeboat. I know, it was a lifeboat. I know, that was where we were supposed to be safe. I did not have an answer because she was right. That was what made it unbearable. Those people had not ignored instructions because they wanted danger. They had entered the equipment built to save them. They had moved from sinking ship to lifeboat, from danger to safety, except the safe place had been lowered into another danger. A disaster does not always punish the wrong choice. Sometimes it punishes a choice that would have been correct 30 seconds later. Another terrible noise came from the stern. The second boat. I did not look. I heard enough. Men along the deck were shouting now with a kind of anger I had not heard before. Not panic. Fury. At the engines. At the ship. At whoever had lowered the boats. At physics itself. It did not matter. The propellers continued. For a few moments, Britannic's greatest strength was killing the people trying to escape her. The engines that had carried thousands of wounded men across the Mediterranean. The engines that had moved the largest hospital ship in the world. The engine's Captain Bartlett hoped might carry us onto the shore of Kea. The same engines were now turning enormous bronze blades beneath the stern. A machine has no loyalty to its purpose. It does what its mechanism allows. A propeller does not know whether it is pushing a hospital ship toward safety or pulling a lifeboat toward death. It turns, that is all. Someone ordered the boats held. Nobody near us argued. Not anymore. If anyone had been desperate to leave the ship 2 minutes earlier, the sight of that water changed them. Britannic was sinking. But for the moment, Britannic was safer than the lifeboats. Think about that. A ship taking water, listing, dropping at the bow, and more than 1,000 people standing aboard because entering a lifeboat too soon could be worse. Safety had become a matter of timing. Ruth sat down on the deck. I crouched beside her. "You hurt?" She shook her head. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Her face had lost its color. "I saw them." "I know. You didn't." "No. Good." She looked toward me. "Don't." I understood. "Do not look." Not because the dead should be ignored. Because the living still had work to do. That was the nurse in her. Even then, especially then, a medical officer passed us. "Get up, stay at your station." We stood. The list had become worse. You could no longer pretend Britannic was merely damaged. The deck itself argued with you. People had to lean. Anything unsecured moved downhill. Doors swung. The horizon was no longer where it belonged. And the bow was lower. But the bow was disappearing. Slowly, steadily. Britannic was settling into the sea from the front. Kea remained visible, beautiful, green, unreachable. For a while we were still moving toward it. Then something changed beneath my feet. The vibration altered, not disappeared immediately, changed. The constant mechanical life of the ship weakened. People looked at one another. The engines? Someone said they were stopping. Someone else said the captain had ordered them stopped. Nobody around me knew for certain. But we could feel Britannic losing speed. Water no longer raced along the hull in quite the same way. The great ship began surrendering her forward motion. That should have been comforting. Instead, it made the sinking feel more real. As long as Britannic had been moving toward land, there had been a plan. Now the plan was gone. The ship was no longer trying to reach safety. Safety would have to leave the ship. Orders changed. Prepare to abandon. Crews returned to the boats. Davits moved. Ropes tightened. People climbed in. The lessons of Titanic were visible everywhere now. There were boats. That sounds simple. It is not. There were places to put people, enough of them. There were mechanisms capable of lowering those boats. There were crews who had practiced. There were routes, stations, procedures. Titanic had turned those things into necessities. 4 years later, necessity was floating beside Britannic. I climbed into a boat with Ruth. I do not remember deciding to. One moment I was standing on deck. The next I had 1 foot over the side. A crewman took my hand. "Careful." The boat hung above the water. That was when fear finally arrived properly. Not during the explosion, not on the stairs, not while watching the first lifeboats. There, suspended between ship and sea, Britannic towering beside us, the water below, the ropes above. Nothing solid beneath my feet except a wooden boat hanging in the air. I hated it. Every part of my body wanted to climb back onto the ship. That is the absurdity. The ship was sinking, and I wanted to return to it because it was large. Large feels safe. The lifeboat felt tiny, fragile, temporary. Ruth sat beside me. "Eleanor?" "Yes, you're holding my hand." I looked down. I was, very tightly. "Sorry, I didn't ask you to stop." So I did not. The boat descended. Deck by deck, Britannic rose above us. From up there, she had been a world. From the side, she became a wall, white steel stretching upward. Portholes, green stripe, red cross. The markings were enormous from this close. The red cross filled part of my vision. I remember staring at it. The symbol of protection. The symbol that told the world what Britannic was. Hospital, mercy, neutrality. None of those words could keep her afloat. The boat touched the water. Everyone tensed. Nothing happened. No violent pull. No sudden movement toward the stern. The engines had stopped. That silence saved us. The crewman at the stern shouted for the oars. Hands moved. Mine too. I was not assigned to row. I rowed anyway. There are moments when hierarchy becomes less important than having available arms. The oar was heavier than I expected. I pulled. Badly. Again, better. We moved away from the hull, not quickly enough. Britannic had become terrifying from the water. The size of her changed. On deck, you understood the ship horizontally. Corridors, wards, distances. From a lifeboat, you understood height. She rose above us like a building that was leaning. More boats entered the sea around us. Some rowed away immediately. Others struggled to clear one another. People shouted directions. The calm blue water had become crowded with wood, ropes, oars, and human beings. Behind everything stood Britannic, still beautiful, still white, still dying. Pull, we pulled. The boat moved. I looked back. The bow was lower still. Open portholes near the damaged side approached the surface. Some were already gone beneath it. The sea entered wherever the ship allowed it. That was what I could see now. I thought of the ward, the empty beds, the white sheets, the bandage I had placed back on the table. Was it underwater yet? Ruth followed my gaze. Our things are down there. Yes, all my clothes. I turned to her. She shrugged. I know it's stupid. It is. I had a good brush. Despite everything, I laughed. She did too. Then both of us stopped because another noise rolled across the water. Metal, deep and long, Britannic settling, a sailor shouting, "Keep clear." We rowed farther. Then I saw people in the water, survivors from the destroyed boats. Some had managed to escape the terrible current. Some clung to wreckage. Other boats were moving toward them now that the propellers had stopped. A man in our boat pointed. There! We changed direction. A woman was holding a piece of wood. Her cap was gone. Her hair covered her face. We reached her. 3 sets of hands pulled. She came over the side coughing. I moved toward her immediately, nurse again. The roll returned before I thought about it. Can you breathe? She nodded. Are you hurt? Another nod, then a shake. She did not know. Neither did I. There was blood near her temple. I touched it carefully, not much. She stared past me at Britannic. Boat, she said. You're in one. She shook her head violently. My boat. I understood, the destroyed lifeboat. We'll find who we can. A promise I had no authority to make, but sometimes people need a sentence before they need accuracy. We pulled another man from the water, then another. The boat became heavier. Someone told us we needed to move away again. Britannic was rolling. That was the new danger, not propellers now, the ship herself. I searched the deck for faces I knew. Impossible. Too far now, too many people. Ruth was beside me. The rescued woman sat between us, wrapped in someone's coat. I looked toward Kia, then back at Britannic. The island had been the destination. Now it was simply the place beyond the sinking. The ship had failed to reach land. We had become the things that needed to reach it. A crewman stood in the stern of our boat. Keep pulling. Nobody asked why. We could see. Britannic's bow was deep in the water. The stern was rising. And for the first time, parts of the ship that belonged beneath the sea began emerging into daylight. The propellers, those enormous bronze blades, the same blades that had been turning minutes earlier, the same machinery that had shattered the first boats. Now they rose above the surface. Wet, motionless. Sunlight flashed across bronze. I stared at them. Ruth saw them too. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. The machine had stopped. The damage had not. Britannic continued downward. The bow sank deeper. The stern climbed higher. And somewhere inside that enormous white hull, the sea was moving through the corridors where I had been standing less than an hour earlier. I looked at my hands. They were blistering from the oar. A thin line of blood had opened on one palm. I closed my fingers around the wood, pulled again. And behind us, Titanic's sister began her final descent. From the lifeboat, it did not look fast. That is the first lie distance tells you. Britannic was so large that movement became difficult to measure. A small boat can disappear in seconds. A ship almost 900 feet long can be dying quickly and still appear to move with terrible patience. The bow continued downward. The stern continued upward. Decks I had walked across that morning leaned toward the sea. Windows disappeared, then another row, then another. The water climbed the white hull as though someone were slowly erasing the ship from the bottom upward. We rowed. Every few strokes I looked back. I told myself not to. I looked anyway. There were still people aboard, tiny figures against white steel, crewmen near the remaining boats, men moving across a deck that no longer resembled a floor. Someone slid several feet before catching a rail. Another man helped him stand. I could not hear what they were saying. That made it worse. From the lifeboat, Britannic had become a silent picture with enormous sounds, metal groaning, steam escaping. Water striking steel, objects breaking loose inside, but the human voices were becoming too far away to understand. Ruth sat opposite me. She had stopped talking. That frightened me almost as much as the sinking. Ruth always talked. She complained about tea, weather, shoes, sheets, officers, food. Silence did not belong to her. Now she stared at Britannic. I followed her eyes. One of the funnels was approaching the water, not because the funnel moved. Because the entire world around it had changed angle. I wondered who was still inside. Engine room men, firemen, crew trying to reach the upper decks. I pictured the passages below, water moving through them, air being forced ahead of it. Lights perhaps still glowing somewhere until electricity failed, doors that had been meant to contain the sea, open portholes that allowed it another route. The ship was losing the argument. Pull, the crewman said. We pulled. He wanted more distance. Everyone did. Britannic no longer needed to touch us to kill us. The water moved by a vessel that size could overturn boats. Loose wreckage could strike us. People jumping from the ship could fall among us. And if the hull rolled far enough before going under, I looked at the white wall of steel. We were still too close. Again, we pulled harder. My palms burned. The skin had opened in 2 places. The pain was clean, simple. I liked it. Pain in your hands gives you something small enough to solve. Grip, pull, release, repeat. I could do that. I could not keep Britannic afloat. I could pull an oar, so I pulled. Behind us, more people entered the water. Some jumped. Some climbed down. Boats moved among them. Hands reached over gunwales. One person after another was dragged from sea into wood. The difference between the Titanic story I knew and the scene in front of me became impossible to ignore. There were lifeboats everywhere. Not enough calm, not enough time, not enough perfection. But boats, seats, routes away. The lessons of 1912 were floating around us. They had not prevented Britannic from sinking. They were preventing the sinking from becoming the same kind of human catastrophe. That distinction mattered. A disaster can repeat without repeating exactly. Later, I would learn that less than 55 minutes separated the explosion from the moment Britannic disappeared. At the time, I knew none of those numbers. There was no clock in my hand, only the ship. And the ship was becoming a clock. Each disappearing deck was another minute. Each degree of angle was another minute. Each boat clearing the hull was another minute. You did not need a watch. You watched Britannic. The stern rose higher. Then the propellers emerged. All 3 blades seemed impossibly large. Wet bronze catching sunlight. Motionless now. Harmless now. Too late for the people in the boats they had destroyed. The rescued woman beside me saw them. She made a sound, very small, then turned her face away. I put a hand on her shoulder. She did not look at me. "Don't," she said. I thought she meant do not touch her. I moved my hand. "No," she said. She turned toward me. "Don't let me look." So I moved. I sat between her and the ship. There are things nurses do that never appear in training manuals. Sometimes you hold pressure on a wound. Sometimes you clean blood. Sometimes you measure medicine. And sometimes you become a wall so another human being does not have to watch what killed her friends. I faced Britannic for her. The stern climbed. For one strange moment, the ship looked powerful again, almost defiant. Its bow buried in the Aegean, its stern high against the blue sky, the great propellers completely exposed, the sun shining on the hospital markings, and I thought of Titanic. I had spent days refusing to think about her. Now I could think of nothing else. I had never seen Titanic sink. I knew only newspaper drawings, descriptions, stories told by survivors, the stern rising, the dark Atlantic, people in boats watching something impossible happen. 4 years later, I was sitting inside the same picture. Different sea, different ship, different war, same family, but there was one enormous difference. Daylight. Titanic had disappeared into darkness. Britannic sank beneath a Mediterranean sun. There was nowhere for the horror to hide. Every detail was visible. The white hull, the green stripe, the red crosses, the bronze propellers, the people in boats, the island beyond us. Even the water was beautiful. I hated that. I wanted the sky to become black. I wanted a storm. I wanted the sea to look guilty. Instead, it glittered. Britannic continued downward. Then the bow must have reached the seabed. I did not understand that in the moment. The water in the Kia Channel was deep, but Britannic was longer than the depth beneath her. Her bow touched bottom while part of the stern was still above the surface. For a brief period, the ship seemed to hesitate. Not saved, interrupted. The hull shifted. The angle changed. Someone in our boat shouted, "Look!" as if anyone was capable of doing anything else. Britannic appeared almost to resist. Then the sea reclaimed the decision. The stern began dropping, not rising anymore. Dropping. That was when I knew. Then the stern moved down, and possibility disappeared. The name was back there. I could not read it from where we were, but I knew it. Britannic, a name chosen for confidence. Empire, scale, permanence. Names look powerful painted on steel, less powerful when the steel is disappearing. The stern touched the water. The sea rose around it. For a few seconds, white steel and foam became difficult to separate. Then the final section slipped beneath the surface. The ship was there. Then she was not. No explosion. No great final cry. No hand reaching from the sea, just water closing over steel. I waited for something else to happen. Nothing did. For several seconds, nobody in our boat spoke. Then the crewman said, "Count." That was the moment I became a nurse again. Count, of course, I turned people, not ship people. That was the work now. I counted everyone in our boat, then counted again. Someone had a deep cut along one arm. One man was bleeding from his scalp. The woman we had pulled from the water was breathing too quickly. Another survivor had injured his shoulder. Nobody in our boat appeared to be dying. That felt impossible. I checked again. The sea around us was full of lifeboats and rafts, some dangerously crowded, some still collecting people, heads in the water, wooden debris, corks, oars, pieces of things that had belonged to Britannic less than an hour before. People began shouting names. George, William, Harry. Names crossing water. Some answered. Some did not. I searched for people from the wards. Ruth was there. That was one. I saw another VAD I recognized in a boat farther away. 2. A medical officer standing in another. 3. The mind does this after catastrophe. It reduces the world. You stop asking whether the ship survived. You ask whether Ruth survived, whether the woman from Ward 4 survived, whether the man who served breakfast survived, whether the crewman who showed you the stairs survived. Civilization collapses into names. Later, the count would settle at 30 dead. At that moment, the counting was still unfinished. 30? I did not know that number yet. We had not finished counting. All I knew was that there should have been more death. A ship that large, gone that quickly, more than 1,000 people aboard. There should have been hundreds. That was what Titanic had taught the world to expect. Instead, everywhere I looked, there were survivors. Wet, injured, terrified, but alive. The boats had mattered, the drills had mattered, the changes had mattered. The fact that Britannic had been outward bound without wards packed with wounded soldiers had mattered too. Luck mattered, timing mattered. The same disaster contains all of them. Preparation and accident, good decisions and bad ones, design and chance. A person survives and wants one explanation. There usually is not one. Ruth looked at the empty water where Britannic had been. How long? I don't know. It can't have been an hour. No, she shook her head. Something that big. I knew what she meant. Something that big should require more time to disappear. But size does not negotiate with flooding. The sea had found enough openings. The ship had lost. We began moving toward shore with other boats. Kia was no longer scenery. It was ground. I looked down at my hands. Blood had mixed with seawater. The blisters were worse. I opened and closed my fingers. Still working. Good, Ruth noticed. You'll complain about those tomorrow. You've complained enough for both of us. There she is. Who? The Eleanor I know. For the first time since the explosion, she smiled properly. I smiled back. Behind her, the place where Britannic had disappeared looked almost ordinary. That angered me. I stared at the blue water. Don't, Ruth said. Don't what? Blame the sea. I was. You look like you're trying. I looked toward Kia. She was right. The sea had not declared war. The mine had been placed by people. The ship had been built by people. The decisions had been made by people. And the lifeboats that saved us had been added because people had learned from other people dying 4 years earlier. That was harder than blaming water, because water does not learn, we do, or we are supposed to. The island grew larger. Houses became visible. Figures waited near the shore. The ordinary world returning piece by piece. I looked back one last time. There was no Britannic, only boats, survivors, debris, and open water. Titanic had left a warning behind. Britannic had carried that warning in steel, boats, and procedures. The warning had not saved the ship. But as we rowed toward Kia, surrounded by hundreds of living people who might otherwise have died, I began to understand something. Perhaps saving the ship had never been the most important lesson. Perhaps the lesson was saving the people. And Britannic, lying somewhere beneath us now, had done that. Mostly. Then the woman we had rescued spoke from behind me, very quietly. "What about the ones in the first boats?" Nobody answered. Because that was the problem with saying the system had worked. 30 people were still dead, and some of them had died inside the very machines built to save them. We rowed toward shore, alive, and carrying that contradiction with us. By the time we reached Kia, we were carrying the dead with us. Not their bodies, not yet, their absence. There is a difference. A body gives grief somewhere to stand, and absence moves everywhere. Into conversations, into empty chairs, into the moment when someone begins counting and realizes a familiar face has not answered. Into the question nobody wants to ask twice. Have you seen her? Have you seen him? Do you know which boat they were in? We reached Kia among other survivors. The island had watched Britannic die. From the sea, Kia had looked like salvation. Green slopes, stone houses, solid earth. When my feet finally touched the shore, the ground felt wrong. It moved beneath me. Of course it did not. My body did. For nearly an hour, the floor beneath my feet had tilted, vibrated, dropped, and rolled. Then came the lifeboat, the sea, the rowing. My body had learned that nothing underneath me could be trusted. Now the earth itself seemed to sway. Ruth stepped onto the beach beside me. She stopped, looked down, then stamped one foot against the ground. "What are you doing?" "Checking." "For what?" "To see if Greece is sinking too." I laughed. It hurt, not physically. The laugh simply did not seem appropriate. Then I realized that was exactly why I needed it. Ruth looked at me. "If the island goes down, I am finished with travel. You were already complaining about travel yesterday." I was ahead of events. People came toward us. Greek villagers, fishermen, officials, sailors, anyone who could help. Blankets appeared, food, water, dry clothing where it could be found. The survivors arrived in pieces. Not physically, emotionally. One person cried, another could not stop talking, another sat completely still. Some asked immediately about friends, some asked about the ship. Some stared at the water as if Britannic might rise again. I did what I knew. I worked. A cut here, a bruised shoulder there, salt water in the lungs. Shock, bleeding, people who needed warmth more than medicine, people who insisted they were fine because someone else looked worse. That afternoon, sitting on Kia with a blanket over my shoulders, I finally looked at my hands. The palms were torn from rowing. Small wounds, ordinary wounds. A nurse beside me cleaned them. I protested. "There are people who need you more." She ignored me. "Hold still. I can do it myself." "I know." "Then let me." "No." She wrapped my left palm, then my right. "You're terrible at being a patient," she said. "I've had very little training." For some reason, that nearly made me cry. Not the sinking, not the propellers, not watching Britannic disappear. A woman wrapping my hand, that was what did it. My body had apparently chosen its moment. I sat there while tears came, quietly at first, then not quietly. The nurse did not tell me to stop. She did not tell me I was safe. People say that too quickly after terrible things. You are safe now. As though the body understands tense. As though fear belongs only to the present. The body does not say, the danger ended at 9:07. Therefore I will stop being afraid. The body remembers the sound, the movement, the angle, the faces, the propellers, especially the propellers. That night I heard them again. There was no propeller near me. Only a room, a bed, other women breathing. But I woke with the noise already inside my head. Wood breaking, metal turning, people shouting. I sat up. Ruth was awake across the room. "You too?" "Yes." We did not discuss what we had heard. We knew. For the first time, I understood Edward's letters better than I ever had. "I am well. The food is terrible. I miss you." What else could he write? How do you put machinery inside an envelope? How do you explain a sound to someone who has never heard it? How do you describe the instant when something built to save people kills them instead? You do not. You write about food. Weather. Home. Small things are transportable. Horror is not. We remained on Kia while arrangements were made. The Navy counted, then counted again. Survivor lists, missing lists, names passed from mouth to paper, paper to officer, officer to ship, ship to headquarters. Eventually the catastrophe became numbers, more than 1,000 aboard, more than 1,000 survived. 30 dead. 30, but numbers change when you know where they came from. 30 was a lifeboat. 30 was a nurse you had seen at breakfast. 30 was an orderly who had carried a crate. 30 was someone whose mother was waiting for a telegram. 30 was someone who had followed instructions, someone who had reached a boat, someone who had believed the boat meant safety. 30 was not small. No death becomes small because history has larger numbers available. And yet, the number also proved something. Britannic had sunk with astonishing speed. She had gone down faster than Titanic. The ship was lost, but most of the people were not. That distinction became the part of the story I carried longest. Titanic had taught the world a brutal lesson. A ship could be magnificent and still fail. Engineering could reduce risk. It could not erase it. Lifeboats had to be sufficient. Evacuation had to be possible. People had to know where to go. Safety could not depend on the assumption that the ship itself would remain afloat. Britannic carried those lessons, not perfectly. Nothing human is perfect. The first boats proved that, but enough had changed that when Britannic disappeared beneath the Aegean, hundreds of people who might otherwise have gone with her were floating above. The sister had learned. That did not save the sister. It saved many of the people standing on her decks. A few days later, I began the journey home. Kia disappeared behind us, then the Aegean, then the Mediterranean. Every ship I boarded afterward seemed too loud, too alive. Every engine vibration made me stop. Every change in speed tightened something in my chest. I watched the water differently. Before Britannic, the sea had been scenery. After Britannic, it became depth. I knew what was beneath the surface now. Not just water, possibility. I returned to England. My mother had already seen Britannic's name in the newspaper. She had seen the word sunk. Then the numbers, then incomplete lists. For days she had lived inside uncertainty. When I arrived at the house in Kent, I stood outside the door longer than necessary. The house looked exactly the same. That offended me. The gate, the window, the little path, the same brass handle. Part of me expected survival to change the architecture of home. It does not. I opened the door. My mother came from the kitchen. She stopped. I stopped. Neither of us spoke. Then she crossed the room and put both hands on my face. That was all. No speech. No question, no crying at first. Her hands. Warm, dry, steady, checking that I existed. I understood. I had spent days counting survivors. My mother needed to count one. Me. I'm home, I said. She nodded. Then she began crying. So did I. Eventually she made tea. Because England can survive almost anything if someone puts water on to boil. The tea was too strong. I drank 2 cups. My mother asked about the ship. I told her some things, not everything. She asked whether I had been frightened. I said yes. She asked whether I had thought I would die. I said yes. She asked what I remembered most. I nearly told her the propeller. Instead I said, rowing. That was not a lie. It simply was not the whole truth. I wrote to Edward. The letter took me 3 attempts. The first was too detailed. I tore it up. The second said almost nothing. I tore that one up too. The third was simple. Dear Edward, Britannic has been lost. I am safe. I am home. I hope you're safe too. I miss you. Love. Eleanor. When I finished, I stared at the page. It looked like one of his letters. That was when I understood him completely. Edward came home after the war. Alive. That word mattered more than any other. Alive. He was thinner, older in ways that had nothing to do with years. He had acquired the habit of watching doorways. I had acquired the habit of noticing floors beneath my feet. He did not ask me to describe Britannic immediately. I did not ask him to describe France. That is one reason I married him. He understood that silence can be an act of kindness. Months passed before I told him about the first lifeboats. We were sitting at the kitchen table. No dramatic reason, no anniversary, no newspaper article. The memory simply arrived. I told him everything I could. The current, the shouting, the boat moving toward the stern, the sound. When I finished, Edward was quiet. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. He did not say, I understand. People say that too easily. Instead, he said, I'm sorry you heard it. That was better. We married. We built the ordinary life I had once imagined before the war made ordinary life feel. A small house. A garden, children, a child running through the kitchen, mud on the floor, Edward asleep in a chair, rain against glass, bread, a garden, a door opening, a person coming home. Years later, my daughter came home from school carrying a book. She was old enough to know about Titanic. Every generation discovers Titanic. The ship waits for them. She placed the book on the kitchen table. Mother, yes, Titanic had sister ships. I looked at the cover. I know. One was called Britannic. Yes, she sank. Yes, my daughter looked at me. Something changed in her expression. Children have a moment when they discover their parents existed before becoming parents. It is almost suspicion. Were you ever on a ship during the war? I looked through the window. The garden was green. Edward had planted beans badly again. I had told him the rows were too close. He had ignored me. Normal life, perfectly normal life. Yes, I said. Which one? I looked back at her. Britannic, she stared. The Britannic? Yes. You were on it when it sank? Yes. Her mouth opened, then closed. What happened? There are answers you spend half a lifetime preparing. I had told doctors, my mother, Edward, other nurses, sometimes strangers. I had told the story in pieces. The explosion, the list, the boats, the propellers, the sinking, the island, the dead, but looking at my daughter, I realized none of those things was the answer I wanted her to inherit. The ship went down, I said. She waited. And I came home, she frowned. That's all? No, I smiled. That's everything. At 12, she did not understand. She would later. The ship went down, and I came home. People remember Titanic because of how many died. Britannic deserves to be remembered partly because of how many did not. That does not make Britannic a success. The ship sank. 30 people died. Some died during an evacuation that should have saved them. There is no version of that story in which catastrophe becomes victory, but there is a lesson, and lessons do not need happy endings. They need consequences. Titanic sank. People investigated. Designs changed. Safety practices changed. Britannic carried some of those changes. Britannic sank. And more than 1,000 people came away alive. But there is an enormous difference between saying, nothing can happen, and saying, if something happens, what have we prepared? That difference is civilization. Not confidence, preparation. Not believing the ship cannot sink, making sure people can leave if it does. 1,500 people died with Titanic. For years later, another great ship from the same family went down, and this time, most of the people aboard escaped. The sister did not survive. The lesson did. Britannic still lies beneath the Aegean. White paint gone, deck silent. Hospital wards open to the sea. The engines that once shook the floors no longer move. The propellers do not turn. The name remains somewhere on the wreck. Britannic, Titanic's younger sister. Built for luxury. Sent to war, changed by one disaster, destroyed by another, and remembered too little. When people ask me what happened that morning, they usually expect the sinking. I understand why. Ships going down make good stories, but the sinking is not the part I think about most anymore. I think about what happened afterward. Hands pulling strangers into boats. Greek islanders carrying blankets. A nurse wrapping my torn palms. My mother touching my face. Edward taking my hand across the kitchen table. My daughter asking what happened. The ship went down. I came home. So did Ruth. So did more than 1,000 others. That is Britannic's story. Not that Titanic's sister sank too. That part is easy. The harder part is this: Titanic died without knowing whether anyone would learn from her. Britannic carried the answer. They did. Not enough to save the ship. Enough to save people. And sometimes that is the only victory disaster allows. The sea took Britannic. It did not take the lesson.